Rex let out a chilling howl, and Delta began digging frantically through a pile of soaked leaves. Seconds later, a pale, twitching hand emerged from the forest floor. The search team froze. Someone was buried alive. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The forest that morning felt heavy, cloaked in a dense silence that pressed down on every movement. Dew clung to the underbrush, and broken tree limbs from the recent storm jutted out like fractured bones. The search teams fanned out with mechanical precision, every boot step sinking slightly into the damp moss, every crack of a snapped twig echoing just a second too long. Yet despite the motion, the woods themselves remained still, as if holding their breath. Mitchell Hale knelt beside a muddy impression near the ridge and ran his gloved fingers over it. A partial footprint, distorted by rain. Deep. Heavy. Possibly dragging. He glanced at Rex, who was pacing in tight loops, nose to the earth, tail stiff and alert. Delta sat motionless, ears perked, eyes locked toward a patch of pine beyond the ravine, alert without barking. That meant something. Hale had worked dozens of recovery operations, and the longer it took, the more certain he became that the dogs were chasing shadows. But this time something gnawed at the edge of his instincts. Rex's movements weren't erratic, they were specific. Repetitive passes over the same downed log, pausing, sniffing, returning. Delta's gaze never left that tree line. These weren't signs of confusion. They were signs of waiting, for something to reveal itself. Emily stood a few yards behind, wrapped in a quilt jacket far too thin for the altitude. Her face was blank, not from calm, but from exhaustion. Her lips were cracked. She held her brother's old hiking watch in her hand, thumbing the face like a rosary. Hale had seen families break, seen hysteria, denial, bargaining. But Emily was different. Still, focused. "He's alive," she whispered. "I don't know how. I just know." Hale didn't answer. He didn't want to break her. Not until he was sure. The dogs moved again, this time together, Delta leading, Rex following without command. They began to descend a steep embankment, carefully navigating twisted roots and loose shale. Hale's breath hitched. The dogs had made their decision. He tapped his radio, voice low. "Delta and Rex in active lead. I'm going with them." There was no theatrical barking, no cinematic sprint, just silent urgency, the kind that didn't ask permission or give second chances. And as Hale followed, stepping deeper into the damp, fog-wrapped ravine, the forest behind them seemed to close like a curtain. The air thickened as Rex's howl sliced through the stillness, low, almost mournful, but pulsing with urgency. Officer Mitchell Hale froze mid-step, his eyes locked on the dog's rigid frame. In all their operations together, Rex had never vocalized like that unless the scent was strong and real. Not a trail gone cold, not a ghost, something living, something close. "Easy, boy," Hale muttered, more to steady his own adrenaline than to calm the animal. Delta came charging in from the side, her bark sharp, decisive, no hesitation. She clawed ferociously at a mound of leaves layered in damp reds and browns. Bits of broken pine needle flew like shrapnel. Hale stumbled forward, heart thundering, blood rushing loud in his ears. The rest of the search team converged behind him, forming a rough semicircle. For a brief moment, no one spoke. No orders, no movement. Just the wet rhythm of Delta's frantic digging. Leaves tore, soil shifted. Then the edge of a fabric appeared, faded gray and caked in mud, tangled in roots. Hale dropped to his knees. At first glance, it looked like an abandoned jacket, maybe tossed by a hunter weeks ago. But the shape beneath it wasn't right. Too curved, too still, too human. "Get me light," he snapped. A flashlight beam hit the mound as Hale peeled back another layer of leaves. His breath caught. A pale, bluish hand, motionless. Then, barely perceptible, a twitch. "Jesus," someone whispered behind him. Hale leaned in, close enough to see the fine tremble in the fingers, the soft hitch of a breath escaping through cracked lips. He was half buried, chest down, his torso slightly twisted and pressed into wet earth. A thick tree limb had pinned his lower leg, splintered and moss-covered, like the forest itself had tried to hold him there. His skin was cold to the touch, his hair was damp with soil and rain, but he was alive. "Subject located. Alive. Repeat, alive," Hale said into his radio, the words catching in his throat. Rex whimpered low, pacing behind him, while Delta lay down beside the body, muzzle nudging Luke's shoulder with impossible gentleness. Her tail thumped once against the ground, not in joy, but in recognition. Luke Adams had survived nearly 80 hours in a forest grave, with no more than a trickle of water from leaf runoff and a will stronger than the storm that buried him. And now, thanks to 2 dogs that wouldn't stop searching, he'd been pulled back from silence, from stillness, from the edge, from... The slope around the ravine turned into controlled chaos. Radios barked urgent codes, and boots thudded against soft ground as the rescue crew surged in, surrounding the body that wasn't a body after all. Gloves tore through debris, cutting through layers of brush and branches to free the collapsed man below. Luke Adams was lifted with surgical care onto the stretcher, his limbs stiff, face ghostly and barely responsive, yet unmistakably alive. A paramedic quickly checked vitals, his voice low but clipped with disbelief. Faint pulse, shallow breath, but he's holding. And through it all, Rex and Delta refused to leave. As the stretcher rose, Rex pushed forward, ignoring Hale's commands for distance. The seasoned shepherd pressed his head against Luke's chest with a tenderness that stilled the movement around them. It wasn't just instinct. It was something deeper, a recognition of fragility. He whined softly, not panicked, but protective, like he feared the man might vanish if he wasn't anchored to something real. Delta circled tight, eyes sharp, body tense. When a medic fumbled a stethoscope and it clattered against a rock, she growled and lunged, not to attack, but to retrieve, snatching it up in her jaws before nudging it firmly back toward the stunned responder. As if to say, "Focus. He needs you now." There was no time to process the emotion of it. Not yet. The stretcher was lifted up the slope, carried through a narrow clearing where the life flight chopper's blades were already whipping up a frenzy of wind and grit. And yet the dogs remained tethered, by duty, by something unspoken. At the edge of the landing zone, Luke stirred. One eye cracked open, his lips parted, cracked and dry. The medic leaned in, expecting the usual, "Where am I? Water. Help." But Luke's voice rasped a single word through the noise. "Dogs." The medic blinked, then nodded, eyes stinging behind protective goggles. He gently squeezed Luke's shoulder, almost reflexively, like trying to pass that moment back to him. Delta stood beside the stretcher, unmoving as the rotors spun faster, wind screaming around her, her ears flattened, but her stance rooted like granite. Hale stepped forward to call her off. She didn't budge. Only when Luke's hand slipped off the side of the stretcher and brushed against her nose did she finally move, nosing his fingers before letting out the softest, most human sound a dog could make. A sound like grief and gratitude tangled into one breath. A flashbulb popped. That photo, Luke in the stretcher, the dog sitting at the edge of the chaos, watching him rise into the air, would become a symbol, not of rescue, but of loyalty in its purest form. The kind that doesn't flinch, the kind that waits, the kind that remembers. The room was quiet, save for the gentle hiss of oxygen and the rhythmic beep of monitors. Luke Adams lay in a dim corner of the ICU, skin pale and lips cracked, a man suspended between the world he'd come from and the one he was still re-entering. His body had been stabilized, core temperature raised, IVs secured, necrotic tissue addressed, but his gaze remained distant, fixed somewhere no nurse or doctor could follow. Until the dogs walked in. Flanked by a half-circle of officers in full uniform, Rex and Delta entered the hospital like soldiers returning from battle. Their service vests were freshly brushed, their gait measured. But their eyes found Luke immediately, without hesitation. No words were spoken. No one needed to explain. Rex made it to the bedside first, lowering his head beside Luke's arm with reverence, as if kneeling at the altar of something sacred. Delta sat at the foot of the bed, eyes trained on Luke's face, unmoving. Luke's breath hitched. Then again. His fingers trembled as they moved toward Rex's fur, brushing through it like a man testing reality. And then, slowly, he broke. The sob tore out of him unannounced, raw, guttural, from some place deeper than pain. His shoulders shook against the hospital bed, and the machines surged with irregularity. No one in the room moved. Even the nurses froze, struck silent by something too pure to interrupt. "They didn't just find me," Luke whispered, voice broken and reverent. "They felt me." The moment was captured not by a camera, but by those who stood there, etched permanently into memory. Still, the image that had gone viral a week earlier, Luke in the stretcher, dogs flanking him like loyal ghosts, surfaced again with new meaning. 3 million shares. Headlines calling them heroes, guardians, miracles with muzzles. But none of that came close to what Luke felt. Emily visited the next day, bringing coffee and quiet. Sitting beside her brother, she finally spoke what she hadn't told anyone else. "You never mentioned it after the war," she said. "But I remember the name, Tank. That was your K9, wasn't it?" Luke nodded. The silence between them grew heavier. "They brought him back to me," he finally said. "Not in body, but in spirit, in instinct, in that moment when I thought no one would come. I knew they would." 30 days later, Luke stood, one prosthetic brace fitted under khaki pants, the other leg wrapped in support. He didn't need to speak at the podium during the fundraiser. The sight of him flanked by Rex and Delta said more than any words ever could. The applause that followed was not for survival alone. It was for the loyalty that refused to believe he was gone. They didn't stop, because they knew.